Fantasy XI Rise of the Zilart was the first expansion in the Final Fantasy series, and it did more to solidify Final Fantasy XI's legacy than most people realize. 11 has been referred to in recent years as a sandbox MMO, for the sense of exploration it fosters. While this was certainly true for the base game, I've found that the content of Rise of the Zilart fosters a sense of exploration and world identity that far surpassed not just the content of the base game, but most video game worlds that I've played. The legacy of this expansion is oftentimes overlooked, however, because it was included in the North American launch of the game. So for many classic players, it may be hard to notice just how much Rise of the Zilart did for the world of the game. While the plot does have some pacing issues, it achieves a degree of world building that arguably no other expansion was able to do afterward. Experiencing this expansion today is a very different experience than when it released though. So how does playing through Rise of the Zilart feel in the modern day? How has time treated this expansion? In this review, I want to look at Rise of the Zilart and its content specifically to see how it stood the test of time. What kind of experience does it offer for players going through it today? The plot of Rise of the Zilart follows the adventurer right after the defeat of the Shadow Lord that takes place halfway through the Nation missions. Preceding his defeat, the rulers of Juno appear to show their involvement with the Shadow Lord. The adventurer then heads to Norg to meet with the father of a young woman named Lion, who we met in the Nation missions. Her father Gilgamesh refers us to a place where we can learn more about Kamlanat and Eldenark. We learn that the rulers of Juno are, in truth, members of an ancient race called the Zilart, and they have plans to open the Gate of the Gods and destroy the enlightened races of Vana'diel. While trying to learn about the Zilart's plans, the adventurer learns about an ancient conflict that took place 10,000 years ago that resulted in the destruction of another ancient race, the Kalu. This conflict between the Zilart and the Kalu serves as the backdrop for both the remainder of the story and the entire story of the next expansion, Chains of Promathia. The journey of this story takes the main character to discover what these ancient races were trying to accomplish, and how the Zilart might be stopped in the modern day. This doesn't all go according to plan though, because Aldo's sister has disappeared following the defeat of the Shadow Lord. Aldo's search for his sister takes him along similar paths as the adventurer, as he's trying to find the way to stop the Zilart, leading to the realization that these two things are indeed connected. What could the disappearance of the only woman who can communicate with the Beastmen have to do with the Zilart's plans to open the Gate of the Gods? This question is what the opening act of the expansion revolves around. The main cast of characters that accompany you throughout the story consist of Lion, a pirate's daughter with a desire to explore the broader world, Aldo, who has a strong desire to protect Vana'diel after losing his home in Tavnazia, Zaid, who is still mourning the loss of his friend from the previous story, and Gilgamesh, who also has a love for the world. These characters are sufficiently fleshed out throughout the game, and it's hard not to grow an affinity for the cast by the time the story is done. Their respective arcs are easy enough to relate to, but they aren't without some faults. One issue that I had with their character arcs is that they aren't long enough to have sufficient emotional impact by the time each setup is paid off. When developing an effective character arc, writers compare these character arcs to rubber bands. The longer they are stretched, the more emotionally impactful they are when finally resolved. But if you stretch the arc too much without the proper technique, the band breaks and the arc loses its effectiveness. The characters themselves are good, as mentioned moments ago. They're really easy to relate to, but oftentimes their arcs are resolved not too long after the setups begin, not giving them enough time to build. The reason for this is that Rise of the Zilart is a very gameplay-heavy expansion, so the amount of cutscenes dedicated to each of these various arcs were sparingly included. In fact, because this expansion is so gameplay-heavy, the setups were no doubt purposefully kept close to the payoff. This was to keep the players going through the story in the classic era from forgetting the setups when the character arcs came to an end. You can see the necessity for this in the classic era when comparing this expansion to the next one, Chains of Promathia, where many players have difficult times following the characters' stories and how they unfold due to the expansions having their setups so far removed from the payoffs. Rise of the Zilart doesn't have that problem. Rather, it has the opposite problem, where so little time is dedicated to the setup for these character arcs that they don't feel as satisfying as they could when finally, 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 None of this is to say that these characters are bad. They most certainly aren't. A character doesn't need a phenomenal arc to be a great character, but they could have been so much more if it wasn't for the harsh cutscene to gameplay ratio. In my personal playthrough, it took me 15 hours to complete Rise of the Zilart, and the expansion only has a little over an hour of cutscene. This ratio of a lot of gameplay to a little bit of cutscene doesn't just affect the characters. The plot of the expansion suffers pacing issues from this ratio as well. If the expansion gave us just a little bit more cutscene time with the characters, villains, and conflicts, it would have done wonders. But the conflict loses much of its tension from being so short. As a consequence, despite how simplistic the story for Rise of the Zilart is, it is needlessly difficult to follow. There are several pivotal moments in the story where I had very little idea as to what was going on context-wise. For a story this short, it couldn't afford confusing the audience. Despite these issues, I wouldn't say that Rise of the Zilart has a bad story. Not at all. This is because of an underappreciated aspect of the expansion. This is the world building and environmental storytelling that the expansion does. The zones of Rise of the Zilart are filled with small clues and secrets that fill the player in on certain aspects of the world. If Rise of the Zilart was a bodybuilder, it skips plot day all the time, but it's world building day every day. While stories that rely too much on world building tend not to be very good, one of the primary draws to the original 11 was its world. Rise of the Zilart takes this to a whole new level. Did you hear about the elemental shards that broke off the crystal? You can find that. And if you do, you get to play through some of the best quests in the expansion. Did you see the giant spine structure in the cutscene? Go find that, and it might have something to do with one of the new jobs. Despite how the expansion handles its plot, the world building in this expansion is unmatched. In fact, it feels like every attribute of this game's story was designed to enhance that feeling of exploration that the game is so well known for. From the Tonberry and their art that they so desperately protect, to the behavioral patterns of the dolls in the ancient Zilart ruins, the game world is trying to tell a secret. The more you explore, the more you learn. One of my favorite examples of this is the first time you enter into the Hall of the Gods. By this point in the story, you know all about Altana and her religion. You know that the plans of the Zilart have something to do with the deity, so you assume it's Altana. As you enter into the larger chamber, you see an immense statue of her cheerful face and wings outstretched. At this point, you realize you can't progress any further, so you turn around and see another similar-sized statue. Rather than having the blessings of outstretched wings, the second statue is hooded, faceless, and bound in chains. By this point, the story has made no attempt to explain what this is, and you get the sense that you're missing something very important. It reinforces that feeling that whether it's one cutscene away or one mission away, there's always another secret. This world has been here for far longer than you have, and it will continue to be here long, long after you're gone. Rise of the Zilart tells about its world through its story, but most importantly, it tells much of its story through its world. This gives the expansion a feeling that no other expansion after it has. I would be lying if I said that this expansion is the best. It isn't. But it is also entirely unlike every expansion after it. From the next expansion onward, Final Fantasy XI took after the more recent mainline entries in the Final Fantasy series in terms of storytelling. While they do share some of Rise of the Zilart's world building, they rely much more heavily on the plot to fill the player in on important information. Considering Final Fantasy's ever-increasing focus on story, I feel confident that saying Rise of the Zilart is the only piece of Final Fantasy content like it in the entire series, and it improved on the base game in exactly all of the right ways. Before I begin talking about the gameplay of this expansion, I need to make one heartfelt recommendation. If you're new to this game and you decide to try it, for the sake of your enjoyment, do not get to max level before playing through this content. If you're wanting to blitz through 11 and its stories, then sure, go for it. But if you have the slightest desire to enjoy this expansion, I strongly recommend finding a level between 75 and 85, and sticking to that level for the duration of this expansion and the next few ones as well. Playing through the game at level 99 completely trivializes much of it, even if your gear is abysmal. Keeping yourself at a lower level allows you to understand how the fights were intended to go, and keeps exploration interesting. There is even a sandbagging mechanic built into the game in the form of limit points. By the way, sandbagging is the term that I'll start using for purposefully avoiding the max level to better enjoy the game. Switching your rewards gained by winning battles from experience points to limit points becomes available at 75. This has two benefits. One, you get to stay at a lower level and thus enjoy the mechanics of the game while you play. The second is, you'll still gain strength, but incrementally. This is because limit points are a form of character progression, but it's much slower, so you don't lose out on rewards while sandbagging through the game. Rise of the Zilart added a plethora of new gameplay systems to 11, including a wealth of new zones, new avatar fights, 4 new jobs, a wealth of new Notorious Monsters, an entirely new Notorious Monster system, and eventually the original Dynamis zones. First we'll go over the new classes, which are Ninja, Dragoon, Samurai, and Summoner. While Summoner isn't technically an expansion job, it might as well be. It came out the same time the expansion did, and all of the avatar quests are locked behind the expansion anyway. First off is Ninja. Ninja is a job with one of the most interesting histories in the game, and while I didn't spend any time leveling it, it is held in fairly high regard. The Dragoon job is one of the more entertaining to play, largely because you get to have a pet dragon. You have to be pretty weird not to appreciate a pet dragon. The recently introduced master level cap of 50 has greatly benefited the Dragoon class as a sub-job. Next is the Samurai job. The Samurai job seems to have been highly relevant in the game's meta for a long time. I can say from personal experience that using Samurai as a sub-job for the first time made me question how I ever played without it. The job itself allowed for much more control and involvement in the battle, and I had a blast leveling it to prepare it for my sub-job. Despite my enjoyment with experimenting with these jobs, the one job I had the most fun playing was the Summoner. While unlocking Summoner felt like playing a game of odds that would make the Powerball blush, after I did unlock it and regained my sanity, finding the elemental cloisters and collecting the 6 starting avatars for the job was an absolute blast. These avatars also reward gear for other jobs as well, so everyone gets to experience these avatar fights, regardless of what job you play. But of course, gaining the ability to summon avatars is the best reward you can pick for these quests, because you have to be really weird to not appreciate having a pet fire lizard. The elemental cloisters are a bit of an iteration on the Cloister of Trials from Final Fantasy X, borrowing some of my favorite elements. In that game, you go to a temple that contains a Cloister of Trials to collect your Aeon. Housing such an Aeon can have effects on the environment around the temple. At Jose Temple in 10, the element of the Aeon has major effects on the building and architecture that houses its faith. In 11, the elemental cloisters of an avatar can also change the environment that they're in. But because you can freely explore the zones, the effects are much more noticeable. North of Yoder and Yotunga Jungle lies Ifrit's Cauldron, a volcano that spews out lava and boulders from time to time, changing the northern reaches of the jungle. The Quicksand Caves houses the Cloister of Tremors, that periodically shifts sand from the Altepa deserts above down into the caves. It just adds that much more intrigue around the celestial gods, these avatars. The fights themselves were also really enjoyable. I was among the foolish who didn't sandbag through this experience, and I played through it at max level, but had awful gear. The avatar fights were the first time I had to strategize as to how I would utilize my job in order to get through the fights. These fights wound up being some of the most enjoyable fights in the game for me. The zone design in Rise of the Zilart is a huge improvement over the original zones. Many of these zones are intricately designed with complex interconnected routes that always make you feel like there's something you're missing. Given how much promise the story gives the world of Vana'diel, these zones could not afford to disappoint, and they most certainly do not. Some of the most memorable zones in the game were implemented in this expansion, such as Sanctuary of Zita, the Boyata Tree, and Ruin Gardens, or Sky. And almost all of these zones have unforgettable music. The zone designs wouldn't be nearly as much of an improvement if it weren't for the Notorious Monsters added to the game in this expansion. The Notorious Monster system is somewhat similar to the hunts that every following Final Fantasy game in the main series would implement from here on out. These NMs are monsters that have special spawn conditions, tend to be stronger than surrounding monsters, and also have a chance of dropping phenomenal gear, for players sandbagging the content anyway. Many of the pieces dropped from these NMs could be dozens of eye levels lower than the gear that is purchasable by this point, but they tend to offer stat bonuses that far outweigh the pure stats of the gear. Rise of the Zilart added many Notorious Monsters, both to the original zones, as well as the new zones, and these NMs made for much more fascinating exploration of the world. It is difficult to not constantly want to check every new monster name that pops up while exploring, with the hope that you find one. Some of these NMs have to be haunted, as the method for spawning them is far more active than passive. There is no better example of NM hunting than the Sky NMs in the final dungeon of Rise of the Zilart. Getting to Sky is easily the most exciting thing that happens in Rise of the Zilart. Walking around on a floating city for the first time feels like nothing else in the game. This beautiful zone doesn't just serve as a final dungeon though. There is an elaborate NM system that they have implemented in this zone. This system resulted in some of the best drops in the game at that time, and even now, after most of the challenges have been trivialized, it is still enjoyable to participate in these fights if there are drops that you're interested in having. This adds so much to the already incredible final dungeon of the game. I'm about to say something very controversial. Ruin Gardens, or Sky, is the best final dungeon in the Final Fantasy series up until this point. The environmental storytelling, spectacle, puzzles, and its phenomenal Notorious Monster system all come together into an unforgettable dungeon that is still enjoyable for players wanting to sandbag the content today. Another gameplay system added in Rise of the Zilart was the first version of Dynamis, a form of battle content that allows you to obtain one of the ultimate weapon or armor types in 11. This battle content places the player in an alternate dimension where they have to battle through one of the cities in the game for certain achievements and rewards. The prize you get for participating is Relic Gear. Dynamis is one of the special monuments left in 11 of a time in the game's history where it not only disrespected your time, but it had the intense desire to consume every bit of it. When Dynamis was first released, and relic weapons were newly achievable, it would take a full link shell of dozens of players' months of active farming in order to obtain just one piece of fully upgraded equipment. Which means that if a link shell decided to farm a piece of gear, you would have to spend hundreds of hours of your life to get someone else in the link shell a gear upgrade. Dynamis nowadays is nowhere nearly as grindy as it was, allowing players to fully upgrade gear in a fraction of the time provided they know what they're doing. But the ghost of the hundreds of thousands of hours spent in that content still haunts its atmosphere. From a new player's perspective, it's also a really nice first step into battle content. While we're on the topic of time sinks, I want to clear up some misconceptions about modern Final Fantasy XI. This game is not at all the time sink it used to be. I've come across dozens of people who say they want to experience the stories, but they don't have thousands of hours to sink into the game to finish them. I remember checking my playtime after finishing the final epilogue quest of Chains of Promathia, the second expansion. I had clocked in 126 hours in the game. Not Chains of Promathia time, I mean 126 hours since I started playing the game. This means that you can create a new character, level 1 job to max level, get 2 sub-jobs to level 50, unlock mounts, acquire all of the game maps, do several extras, finish both halves of the base game, Rise of the Zilart, and Chains of Promathia, all in 126 hours. My reason for pointing this out is that 11 now does a phenomenal job at respecting the player's time, regardless of what so many people falsely believe. One last thing I wanted to touch on regarding Rise of the Zilart, and Final Fantasy XI in general, is the way the game keeps much of its content enjoyable. Starting in 2013, following the Seekers of Adulin expansion, Square has implemented a system called high-tier battlefields, which are essentially far more difficult versions of older fights. One of the expansions that experienced this was Rise of the Zilart. All of its avatar fights now have more difficult versions, and all of the final dungeon fights do too. So even though the story versions of these fights have been trivialized, the content itself is still relevant and enjoyable because of these more challenging versions. These versions of the fights offer rewards that still help players in the endgame today too. This is true for many other expansions as well. While this is a topic I'll be covering more in depth at a later point, I felt the need to include this in this review because the latest Master Trial that Final Fantasy XI got is one based off of the final boss of Rise of the Zilart. For those who don't know, Master Trials are the hardest super boss types in 11. While not all of them are nearly as difficult as they once were, if you play them with the setups they were intended for, they serve as the ultimate test for the player's knowledge of the game's mechanics. In some ways, they can be compared to ultimates from Final Fantasy XIV, and at the time of making this video, the newest Master Trial brings some of the bosses from Rise of the Zilart into the spotlight once more. There are only 19 new pieces in the soundtrack of this expansion. Every single track is catchy, beautiful, and memorable. Not only is this music beautiful though, but the right song is used for the right moments almost every time. Every great moment in this expansion was greatly improved by the music choice included in that scene. I'm not just referring to the story either. The first time you come across the ancient city of Romave, it plays a piece that is perfect for the moment. The Hall of the Gods scene I mentioned earlier is another great example of that. And finally, you could possibly step out into Sky for the first time and not have that piece of music burnt into their brain forever. A phenomenal example of this is the final boss of the expansion. This is the piece of music that plays as the final boss is preparing to open the gate of the gods, and you're trying to stop him. After you defeat him the first time, the battle becomes far more frenetic, the villain becomes more desperate to succeed, and this is the piece of music that plays at that point. It's hard to imagine a song with more impact playing at this point of the story. This is only one example of many of how the music is masterfully used. There are two opposing schools of thought when it comes to music and media. One group of people claim that having a strong central melody is the most important thing when writing a soundtrack. Another claim that as long as the piece fits the instance it's used, it doesn't matter whether or not the music has a strong melody. The music in Rise of the Zilart tends to be both powerfully melodic, without sacrificing any of the ambience in its sound design and accompaniment. This is a fairly rare feature in video game soundtracks, and despite how few new pieces this soundtrack included, I found myself excited to see what the next zone sounded like while I progressed the story missions. This expansion would not be nearly what it is if it wasn't for the soundtrack. Rise of the Zilart is one of the most unique expansions in Final Fantasy XI. Unfortunately, it isn't thought of that way. Because it was released with Final Fantasy XI in North America, it has been part of the game from the very beginning. And due to how well it complements the base game, it can be tough to tell where one starts and the other begins. Regardless, for players who want to experience a story that enriches the world of Vana'diel in a way that no other expansion does, Rise of the Zilart will be here for you. It also adds some incredible jobs that play like nothing in the base game. It adds dozens of incredible new zones, an unforgettable final dungeon, and 19 pieces of phenomenal music that I'll continue to listen to for years to come. Rise of the Zilart was the first expansion in the mainline Final Fantasy franchise, and it most certainly does not disappoint. Thank you for watching my video.